We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order.
So on this week's Multipolarity, we have our regular guest, Malcom Kyeyune, back, and we have something special for him. He's been doing a little bit of journalistic field work. He traveled to the United States for, I believe, the first time to the Great America, and went to DC, and you attended a military conference with lots of US military people, and discovered quite a few interesting points on what's going on with the US military over there. So maybe we get started, since you hadn't visited America before and you obviously write about it quite a bit. What were your impressions?
I mean, in a lot of ways, I suppose it kind of confirmed my prejudices. And we can maybe get into what those are a bit later on. But one striking scene was just flying in from the airport, or driving in towards DC from the airport, and being shown all of these like new areas, these new zip codes in Virginia, where essentially, like, these are the richest zip codes in the US, a lot of them, and they're all pretty new. Like DC 40 years ago was actually really poor. It was a backwater. Because DC 40 years ago was the capital of a republic. But in the last 40 or so years, these areas around DC have become incredibly rich. Why? Because DC is now the capital of an empire. And you have all of these military contractors and all of these NGOs and so on, and they're raking in the cash hand over fist from the government. And so you really got to see a bit of that side of DC as you drove in. And then really as you sort of walked around in DC, like you really got the sense of an imperial rather than a republican capital.
Okay, well, maybe tell us a bit about the conference, what you can. Obviously, I'm sure it's subject to some rules, so we don't have to name names or anything, but I think we're just more interested in the general picture rather than specific details.
Yes, so this was essentially a sort of educational course held in sort of cooperation between George Washington University in DC and then the military, principally the US Army. And so when I was invited to this, I was kind of dubious as to whether I should accept or not, because I thought, like, okay, well, I'm a guy living in Sweden. What exactly can I even contribute? Like, it feels kind of presumptuous almost to ask them to fly me over to DC to sort of tell them what's wrong in America. But I eventually accepted, and the talk I was holding was actually very well received, and depending on how things shake out, it might not be the last time I visit DC under these sort of circumstances. But the essence of it was basically to try to give people inside the US military a sort of update on, the strategic environment in general in the world, I would say. So it kind of fell within the ambit of something, what Multipolarity is doing, for example. Like, your ideas would not be out of place in that course, for the simple reason that people are sort of realizing that things are seriously changing, and that, like, we have to understand what these changes are, essentially.
Look, I'm not terribly surprised that people who are actually having to think about these things and plan for them are coming to relatively similar conclusions to dissident podcasts and journalists and writers and so on. It doesn't surprise me all that much, but I don't know. Maybe you can give us some better sense of what the mood was, and why you felt that mood was there.
Yeah. So regarding the mood, like what you have to understand is that most of these people were inside the active US Army. There was a smaller contingent from the other services, much smaller, like uh, I would say like 95% of these people were either Army or Army Reserve. But then you had people from like the DoD on the civilian side, for example. But I point this out just to sort of buttress the point about the mood. And the point about the mood here is people really, I got the sense is that almost everyone understood that something was seriously wrong and things were getting even more wrong. Like the US was in a pretty bad place and the course was not a positive one. The course was actually one where things were destined to get a lot worse than they are today. And this on a couple of different levels. So people were pretty black-pilled, I would surmise, regarding the state of the US political system. Again, that's no big mystery. That's not a product of any sort of particular insight on their part or mine. It's just, you open up the newspapers and you read about the lawfare, you read about like all of these massive problems both parties are having, and you kind of get the sense that the American Republic isn't doing particularly well. When it comes to the military, though, what I really saw was this big divide between people inside the US military and people, civilians. And this is kind of a big problem in the West. If you think about someone who massively identifies him or herself with a Western military supremacy, with the idea that the West's military is much, much stronger, much more powerful, much more advanced than China or Russia put together. Like these people tend to be much more fanatical the farther away they are from America's country. So tell that to an American that, the US isn't super powerful enough to, be able to take on Iran and Russia and China at the same time. If that guy is an American, he's probably going to go, yeah, I don't believe you, or yeah, sounds about right. Tell that to some, Remainer in Britain, and that person is going to pull out the pistol and challenge you to an old-timey duel. Like, how dare you besmirch the honor of, the American military? Like, I have to shoot you now to defend the honor of the U.S. Army. And, it's even worse if you talk to some Europhile or whatever in Romania or whatever. These people are completely married to the idea of U.S. military dominance. But so you have this sort of divide. But then again, if someone is a civilian, they tend to be much more gung-ho about the military than someone inside the military. People inside the military don't need the sort of jingoistic pride in the institution because they live in the institution and they know it has a lot of problems. So what I saw, to make a long story short, was a complete absence of the sort of jingoism that you see in the West today regarding Western military power. Like these people know that the US military is in deep, deep, deep crisis. And they know that civilians are not paying any fucking attention to that crisis because they're so trapped in their own, like Peter Pan Neverland, where the US military is forever strong and, nobody ever grows up or grows old. So a kind of a sense of hopelessness is maybe too strong a word, but not entirely inaccurate a word to describe sort of the feeling regarding the relative role of the US military in solving the crises of the West. Because this is no news to you at the Multipolarity podcast, but like someone like you, Philip, would probably agree with me when I say a lot of things are going wrong in the West today. Like Western policy is kind of broken, right? Like the sanctions are failing, the diplomatic game is not going particularly well, and so on. Well, these people in the military kind of realize that for every failure, what idiot civilians will do is they will say, okay, well, we failed diplomacy, we failed sanctions, but that's fine because the military will step in and they'll bail us out. So the more we screw up, the more the military will rise to the occasion and just save us from our own mistakes. And the people inside the military know that this is the dynamic, and they go, oh my God, we're doomed.
So let's have a look at some of the specifics regarding this. In the late 80s, you had the revolution of military affairs finally started to filter through into the US military. It showed that it was ahead of the curve on things like stealth and precision strike, as well as pretty impressive combined arms warfare, albeit against in Iraq and a severely overmatched opponent. It also had, as recently as the late 1990s, a two-war standard, a two-army standard, in that it was at least built to be capable of fighting two wars simultaneously in two different parts of the world against pretty decent opponents, like near-peer opponents, I think was the terminology used. And of course, in the late 80s, 10 years before that, it was built and designed to take on the scores and indeed hundreds of divisions of the Soviet and Warsaw Pact armies. So, how has it slid so far so quickly? I understand that China poses a unique challenge, but it's, when you start talking about hopelessness and an inability to bail out the US political class, that seems like a pretty serious slide beyond just talking about, the expansion and growth of China.
Well, I mean, that's kind of the problem with the dynamic that you describe here, is that if people weren't being particularly ideological and sort of dissecting this with the benefit of historical distance, let's say. So let's say if you and I, we weren't talking in 2024, but in 224, so like 200 years from now, we wouldn't be looking at a particularly big mystery. So if you think about the US defense industrial base, it was slaughtered. It was brought out to slaughter, stuffed, and mounted on a wall the moment the Cold War ended. Like a lot of US Army units, like I think the 3rd Armored Division, for example, they had their last hurrah in Operation Desert Storm, and then they were unceremoniously abolished. And so the US military industrial complex went from something like 50 prime contractors to 5 in 20 years of time. Well, what do people expect would happen? Like if you have 50 prime contractors and you go down to 5, that's not stasis. That's not you coasting along. That's you slaughtering your own defense industrial base. And so people sort of slaughter their own defense industrial base because it costs too much money, essentially. And then they woke up one day and they said, oh my God, for some reason, we don't have a defense industrial base. Like, how did this happen? Well, I mean, there's no mystery here. There really isn't. People said in the 90s, we have to slaughter the defense industrial base. Now we're dealing with the consequences. So what's really the guilty of this sort of, well, what the hell happened, bros? Like, that's just this sort of, that's a mental distortion, essentially, created by everyone in the US getting extremely complacent. Again, with the benefit of historical distance, nobody would say that, well, okay, if you just got your defense industrial base, you're never going to suffer some sort of severe consequences from that. But the Americans did that, and they sort of drank the Kool-Aid about being at the top of the world and having sort of transcended warfare because they had a new system that would create eternal peace on Earth. and every sort of military action would just be a policing action against some like poor, pathetic rogue states like Serbia, whatever, who refused to wake up and smell the democratic coffee. So again, like the US military was basically slowly, it was first of all starved of any sort of incoming resources. And then eventually, like even the maintenance level was dialed down. And the only surprising thing in 2024 is that people are surprised. Like, again, what would the alternative have been if you slaughtered the defense industrial base? Like, is it going to walk around like magically creating all of this stuff pro bono? Like, is McDonnell Douglas going to remain an operative company with everyone just pitching in like it's a lemonade stand or something? Like, it's just, this is just chickens coming home to roost, really.
To give the alternative view here, can I just ask, you know, in the 1950s, the US, you know, was full of can-do spirit, this idea that they'd conquered Nazism, that they, you know, anything was possible, that this huge and growing middle class, everybody was happy. In the late 50s and early 60s, there was a lot of concern that they were falling behind the Soviet Union, and they had a concerted effort again where they, you know, they had the Apollo missions, and they, you know, built out or had like a fairly significant military at that stage, and there seemed to be real growth again with the Great Society. And then there was a great kind of crash of national confidence in the 1970s where, you know, they were bogged down and ultimately defeated in Vietnam. They had the Nixon scandal. You know, they'd come off a series of political assassinations. There was a very dark mood in the US again. And then Reagan came along. You had Morning in America. Everything was fantastic. They went and defeated communism. They had all of these new military platforms coming online, like Tomahawk cruise missiles and Abrams tanks, and, you know, stealth bombers, and, you know, Los Angeles class submarines, and Nimitz class carriers a little bit earlier than that, and so on and so forth. And in the 90s, you had this real hubris. And now I've had like another crash, basically, another crash where, you know, it's, you know, all hopeless and woe is me. But, yes, it's still got what, like 900,000 men that it, or personnel, I should say, these days, that it can put under arms in the, you know, at the beginning of a war in theory. That seems to me a really large number. All militaries have their problems. The American military is more open than most militaries, you know, because of the system in the US. It's far more open and available to criticism. It still has, you know, pretty advanced weapons platforms. It has pretty advanced command and control systems. It has the biggest navy in the world by tonnage. I mean, are we not going a bit far here to say that it's all hopeless, Malcolm? I mean, are we not buying into yet another of America's kind of existential swings in mood between, you know, the end is nigh and we are the greatest thing since sliced bread, and kind of God's divine will on earth? I mean, you know, surely between those two extremes, there must be some kind of midway point, some happy medium.
Well, yes and no. I would say, and this is kind of what I said to the people, the students in the course. I mean, if you think about America as a country, there's no reason at all to be negative in the long term. If you're talking about the current sort of American empire, it's screwed. In the same way that, you know, there's a Russia today, parts of Russia are probably a fair bit nicer than they were, you know, a decade before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So Russia hasn't gone, the Russian military hasn't gone, but the Soviet Union was unsalvageable by the end. Well, it's kind of the same with these sort of sclerotic institutions that the US has. So you have this all-volunteer force model, but the model is completely broken. The all-volunteer force model is not salvageable at this point the US military has actually stopped talking about recruitment as a problem because the problem is now incurable. Like it's gotten so deep that there's no way to actually save the current sort of unit structure on the books. Even if things were to kind of mildly turn around, this is like, a cancer patient where the cancer has metastatized. And there's no energy in the system for any sort of actual workable reform, which is the real problem. Yes, the US military has over 1 million active duty personnel, I would say. And the US Army, for example, has more than 400,000. It's between 400 and 450,000 active duty at this point, the US Army. It's just that like these 450,000 are spread out over too many units. So there's 450K, but they're sort of manning a force structure that probably would need something like 500K to work. And it's actually, that's kind of misleading because like at this point, like the force structure is probably pretty lopsided. So there's a massive lack of combat arms personnel. Like there's too many janitors and not enough trigger pullers. But like again, yeah, you could solve this tomorrow by simply downscaling the amount of units and saying, well, we're not strong enough to have this old US military. We're going to have to shrink our footprint because like we're not up to the task. Yeah, well, that's the thing that's never going to happen. Like a lot of people inside the US political system would rather have, 2 units where none of them are actually combat capable than just abolish one of those units and say, well, sorry, America isn't strong enough to have these 2 units, so we're down to 1. And that's why people are feeling pretty hopeless right now, because they realize that the dysfunction inherent in the political system, like that's not going to be solved. To take the Navy as another example, one common complaint from the Navy is that American politicians want the Navy to act as if it had 600 ships still, which is the size it had after Vietnam. And at the peak of the sort of Reagan rearmament period, I think it went up to 600 ships again. But the US Navy is now a 290 ship Navy. And so people say, well, why can't we act like a 290 ship Navy? And then everyone just says, no, we can't do that because that would be admitting that America is weaker. I mean, it demonstrably is weaker because it has 290 ships instead of 600 ships. But the inability for people to admit that and the inability to actually do reforms according to material reality, that's the real death knell. That's the death sentence of the current order. Just as, the Soviet Union didn't collapse because Russia ran out of resources or industrial capacity or people serving in the military. No, those things were still there. But the sclerotic political system could no longer sort of reform with the times.
Yeah, there was actually an article out this week in the Washington Post, which I think is kind of maybe even highlights some of the issues that the denialism basically that you're talking about are creating. So it was a fascinating article. It's terrible in a way, but it was fascinating in its terribleness. It was called "The U.S. Military Plans a Quote Unquote Hellscape to Deter China from Attacking Taiwan." And just to kind of run through some of the points of the article, I mean, it basically said that there was no plan. If Taiwan does something, I think we've talked about it on the show before. We think that an invasion is highly unlikely, that a blockade or something like that would be more likely. I thought that view had been arrived at in DC because I think the Atlantic Council put out a paper on it. But basically, they admit that there's no clear plan, and actually, they have a really interesting quote from President Trump, which was buried in a Daily Beast article or something, where he apparently told a GOP senator while he was in office that there's not that when he was asked what would happen if the if something broke out there, he said, there isn't an effing thing we can do about it. Feels like classic kind of Trump, just telling the truth to everyone's chagrin. Anyway, so in response to this, they have this idea that they're going to use drone swarms to try and like interfere with the Chinese ships or whatever until the cavalry arrive. Now, where the cavalry come from, I don't know. But the really interesting thing, okay, two things stand out about this article, and they're related. They say in March, the Defense Department announced it would spend $1 billion on a program called Replicator to build swarms of unmanned surface ships and aerial drones for this very mission. And the second point is it says the timeline for delivery of these systems is unclear. Okay, add that up. First of all, $1 billion from the DoD is like pennies. Like, the idea doesn't sound completely prima facie absurd, and I mean they're probably watching the effectiveness of drones and so on in Ukraine or in the Red Sea or whatever. Why would they only allocate $1 billion? And then why would they report it in the Washington Post with no steady deadline in place? Because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I think this is the kind of basically cope that occurs when you have such a dysfunctional institution. So, I mean, I guess I'd ask, what were the actual military people's view of the actual dysfunction itself? Obviously, they're aware of it. Do they blame it on the politicians, or do they blame it on the media class, or the whiteboard people, or the PowerPoint people that run the place, or do they think it's a deep structural problem, or what?
So, all right. So to answer that question, my sense is that, I mean, there's probably some mixed opinion, but in general, I would say that the military probably considers this to be in large part a civilian problem, but also a problem of people in the military hierarchy being cowards and complicitous and unable to actually get the military perspective across. So like this massive gulf between civilian life and military life is to blame, and this is probably something that's mostly caused by civilians, but the military hasn't really been helping. They've been making things worse. And so to take Taiwan as an example, like, you have to realize there is no planning being done for a war with Taiwan. There is zero planning. Anyone who tells you that there is planning being done for a war with Taiwan, they're lying to you. They're either bullshitting you, or they've been bullshitted themselves, for the simple reason that, a war effort, it's kind of like a car. You have some things that are nice extras, like, a good stereo system, but then you have some components that are absolutely necessary. So in a car, if you're leasing a car on your vacation trip or whatever, and it comes without, say, a steering wheel, or a gas pedal, or a suspension system, or wheels, or an engine, or a gas tank, it doesn't matter how nice the other sort of accoutrements of the car is. Doesn't matter if the windshield is of the finest quality. Like, the car without an engine is not going to drive. And so a car without an engine, with the best windshield in the world and heated seats, that's just a paperweight. It's not a drivable car. And it's kind of the same with, the US military's efforts in the Pacific. So, for example, the US military at this point, since they closed down the massive fuel base at Red Hill on Hawaii, due to groundwater contamination because of deferred maintenance, at this point, they basically no longer have a sort of logistical capacity to ferry more fuel to the Pacific in the case of a war. So everything is going to have to work off pre-positioned fuel supplies. And it's the same with ammo, for example. Well, I mean, having a war effort in the Pacific, which is very far from, the Taiwan is very far from America, but very close to China. But if you have a war plan that doesn't really answer the question of How will I get fuel to my ships or ammo to my soldiers? You don't have a war plan. It's really that simple. And it's the same with like, how will we replace our munitions and so on? Like the US has in war games, the US runs out of ammo in a week, and there are no plans for, replenishing the ammo. War games now show that the US loses a very significant part of its navy and its air force, and it cannot rebuild these things. There's just no plan. There's just this sort of cope, because what people will admit freely at this point is that the US, the war on Taiwan, and you remember this, Philip, when Americans really started getting hot and bothered about, potentially going to war with China over Taiwan, microchips were like this perennial obsession, right? But now, after the failure of the sanctions and the fact that the Chinese have now shown themselves to be far more interested in building their own microchip infrastructure to outcompete Taiwan rather than trying to usurp the extant infrastructure on Taiwan, Americans have stopped talking about the microchips, but they haven't stopped talking about Taiwan, because now Taiwan, and you hear this straight from the horse's mouth, straight from Elbridge Colby and everyone else who's sort of a serious thinker, like Taiwan is just about American credibility. If we give up on Taiwan, the empire collapses because nobody will ever trust us again. Well, I mean, all of what you describe as cope, Philip, flows from that basic fact that the Americans are down to the wire here in terms of the credibility of their empire. And what they're doing is they're dumping all the burdens on top of the US military. Okay, let's say you have a Liz Truss style crisis, which you have warned about. Let's say that happens at the end of this year. As the US kind of wallows in its political dysfunction, the only result of that is going to be people saying, oh, well, okay, now people in Japan and South Korea are looking at us even more dubiously because they see we're having a Liz Truss style crisis. That means the US Navy, the Seventh Fleet, is going to have to work extra hard to maintain US credibility. So as everything falls apart inside the US political system, everything gets dumped over on the sort of generator of confidence of last resort, the US military. These people realize that they're being paid for fools, and they realize that they can't actually compensate for all of the other crises breaking out across the political landscape in the US.
I suppose the question that's most relevant to this scenario is whether anybody in the US military believes that they can recover a capacity to defend key American strategic interests. Because I think it's fair to, despite what you said there, Taiwan, because of its location, is a strategic interest. If Taiwan falls, then the first island chain that kind of hems in China becomes extraordinarily difficult to hold together. And they would have to fall back to the second island chain, or perhaps even as far as Hawaii, potentially, which would in turn give up East Asia to Chinese dominance, which would mean that a geopolitical rival would be in control of the center of global economic activity. Now, obviously, in that scenario, the US would still be, a very powerful nation. But in that situation, over time, it's entirely possible that it would become the second most powerful nation. So, I think Taiwan is a strategic interest in, insofar as that kind of game theory, if you like. But I mean, is there a sense within the U.S. military that, for instance, I hear people like Elbridge Colby, who you mentioned earlier on, and he does seem to understand the gravitas of the situation. In fact, when I read his tweets, I say this with greatest respect because I think he's actually one of the more sensible commentators in the US, and I think he believes in a kind of a strong US military to deter any potential attack on Taiwan, and thus avoid any situation where the Chinese might be tempted to start a war and overturn the status quo. But I read in his tweets a very keen sense that the US needs to get moving on rebuilding its military capacity, because certainly in Ukraine, it's become clear that Russia by itself is producing more kind of basic ammunition and more missiles even than the entirety of NATO combined. I mean, in the last kind of year, 18 months or year or so, they've been increasingly reliant on South Korea's manufacturing capacity, and South Korea is a non-NATO country. Now, if they're being outproduced by Russia, goodness knows what's going to happen if they get into a war with China, which is the global manufacturing superpower, like what the US was in 1940 and 1941. China is now in its ability to just have an enormous manufacturing capacity that can be turned over to military production. It seems to me anyway that in any war between the US and China, the US is going to have to rely on bringing to bear all its kind of exquisite, expensive weaponry at once to score one victory that's so decisive that the rest of the war becomes just a kind of mopping up exercise. It shifts the tactical and strategic calculus. Well, and if it goes beyond that, they're done. But I mean, is there a sense that, look, they need to get their act together here and rebuild and put together a force that matches their strategic ambition?
I mean, not really, because if you say we have to get our act together, the question is why? Why do we need to get our act together in pursuit of what sort of political or strategic goal? And this is the problem with the United States right now. There is really no political or strategic goal. There is really no sort of why. There is no narrative for why the empire is worth defending at the end of the day. And, I actually met him in DC, and he sort of playfully admitted, like, this is one of the areas of Malcom Kyeyune's critique that I still don't have an answer to, but that I hope to find one day. Colby said in his own lecture. And the critique he was referring to is basically me pointing out that, nobody in the American body politic is really interested in this crap. Like, they don't feel the empire is working for them. And if you talk about so like one of the other sort of points being made by one of the speakers was essentially that there was an argument on the course being made for a return to the free war army and military. So presumably a military designed to fight China, Russia, and Iran or North Korea at the same time, because we don't get a choice. These people all hate us. They're bringing the war to us. And how was this going to be paid for? By massive cutbacks to social spending and Medicare. And at that point, I'm just asking myself, okay, so how are you going to sell this to Americans? Like, we have to defend the empire by cutting your Medicare and Medicaid. And, oh, shit, like a third of Americans almost are now skipping meals already because groceries prices are too high. That's the perfect time to abolish food stamps. We all have to pull together. And it's like, if you say that, people are going to say, well, this empire can go jump in a lake. I don't care. So that's kind of the that's not necessarily the military attitude. The military attitude is kind of cognizant of what I just pointed out, that like they're kind of pushing on a string here. They're going out on a tree limb where it's not really designed to carry the weight. But there's also this other realization, which is, I think, far more acute, and which is also something that Coleridge doesn't really have a good answer to, which is this dynamic I hinted at earlier of overloading the military with problems that the military did not create and cannot be expected to solve. So yes, Elbridge Colby wants a US Army that is, strong so it can deter. Well, if Nancy Pelosi goes over to Taiwan, riding shuttle traffic over there, making public announcements about how Taiwan isn't a part of China and soon it will, with American help, be, a free and independent nation and abandon China. Like, that's going to piss the Chinese people off. And, if the political side of the US system keeps doing stuff like that, the military cannot necessarily automatically solve that by refurbishing another cruiser or something. Like, at some point, there has to be some sort of coordination within the American political system so that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. And this is just impossible in America today. So the sense inside the military in some way is just that, we get to take the blame, take the burden for everything else in America being a total, like, goldfish bowl clown show. And people aren't particularly enthusiastic about that because they know they're getting a raw deal. Like, they know they're getting a losing hand.
Well, okay. Well, why don't we address that final point then, before we end the political and economic problem? I mean, this really is, as you're describing it, it's these problems that, as you say, the military is having to shoulder, and they seem to be, as you say, increasingly relied upon to shoulder them. Well, it's I see it's in the paper recently that a presidential candidate who is currently leading has been has criminal charges. He has a criminal conviction against him. I don't think we need to tell listeners what that means. I think even the most not happening bro knows exactly what that means. They know that a line is being crossed. They know that American politics will probably not be the same, at least for the next decade or two, after that conviction has taken place. I don't think anyone would deny it. It's too obvious. And then on top of that, of course, as we won't go into it again, it's on previous shows, but we've talked about the potential for a Liz Truss style run, especially if and when Donald Trump, the criminal, gets elected. I think there could be, as I've said before, kind of a plan on that. Commercial real estate markets back in the news too. I think that feeds into the fact that the US economy, I think I said on Twitter, is held together with rubber bands and bits of string, and it is going to unwind probably after the election as well. So you have a dual, I think a very likely outcome 2025 is a dual political and economic crisis. Um, Obviously, that's a very specific view, but would I be right in saying that the people you were hanging around with are cognizant of those issues too? And what was their general thinking on it?
I mean, I brought up this sort of trial, and people kind of agreed, because it's not a big mystery, sort of. Like, it's a huge problem what's going on in the political system, and it's also a huge problem when this leads to a loss of faith in the U.S. empire or U.S. reliability, because the military, it's not like it's going to get more resources or anything like that, right? Because because Congress can't actually do anything, or because the lawfare is getting out of hand. So there is that. And also, people are keenly aware that the deficit is just this unsolved, massive, hydrogen bomb that's going to blow everything up. Because it is, right? I mean, if you compared the situation, and I did write a piece for Unheard about this, but like, the deficit situation in the US, it's completely unsalvageable. There's no way to escape the event horizon of the debt at this point. There's like, $35 trillion in official state debt, and then there's like $175 trillion in sort of unfunded liabilities, kind of a sort of shadow debt of future commitments that currently lack funding. The French monarchy, when it succumbed to the revolution, it was basically on the brink. If it had managed to sort of do these tax reforms that were being suggested in 1786 and 85 and 87, and just sort of cut down some of the more exorbitant revenue expenditures, like they could have basically over a 15-20 year period paid off their debts. There's nothing like that in the offering for the Americans. So like people realize that this system, it's not long for this world. And once you get like a massive crisis, and the definition of a political crisis is literally just at the simplest level, a period where you can't go on like you did before. You have to do something new. Like staying still or going back is no longer an option. Everyone senses that this point is approaching at lightning speed in the US. We're not talking 10, 15, 20 years. We're talking, 10, 15, 20 months at this point. People will cry out for the US military to just, okay, well, now everything is broken, but at least we have you guys. At least we can trust you. At least, like, while we figure out what went wrong with America, please use zero resources to defend against this country, China, with 250 times the shipbuilding capacity you guys do. And we might do a lot of things to start a pot and make the Chinese furious with us, but please take us our zero additional dollars and just, hold the line. The US military isn't going to do that. So I think there's just a great sense of unease and foreboding right now regarding all of these issues that aren't going to be solved without some sort of massive, chaotic showdown of some sort. And you're starting to see the signs of that big upheaval coming right now.
You've been listening to Multipolarity. Subscribe or follow for fresh episodes every week.